Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. That's our slow crawl through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book and author by author. What Hannah at Hannah's Books refers to as my March of the Penguins, which I've been told, technically speaking, counts as a waddle. Steve's great waddle. And we have been moving through the ancient world. We've seen the ancient works of Rome, and we just recently did the Psalms, and the ancient works of Greece. And we're back to Greece today with a name that needs no introduction. This is Plato. This is the Protagoras and the Meno, and this is a Penguin Classic that I have. This is a translation by Adam Beresford. And I also have The Last Days of Socrates in a Penguin Classic, a translation by Christopher Rowe that includes the Euthyphro, the Phaedo, the Crito, and also the Apologia. And that combined, the editors decided to combine them into one volume. So I have these two Penguin Classics. There are probably two other volumes that I don't have. And once again, we're going to talk about some similar themes here. You might think that one of those similar themes would be me pouring contempt on Plato because he was, a teacher of Aristotle, and I don't have much in the way of positive things to say about Aristotle. But no, Plato's Socratic dialogues exist at an interesting intersection between what would later become formal philosophy and drama, and fruitfully so. They exist at that crossroads to their benefit because they're unfailingly interesting to read. They involve people. There are people involved, personalities involved. There are things that the speakers in these dialogues say or do or prefer that are said or done or preferred only because of idiosyncrasies of character, not because that person is some sort of impersonal mouthpiece for an idea or a viewpoint or a stance. I very much appreciate that. Plato I can read for pleasure, whereas Aristotle, I don't believe it's possible to read Aristotle for pleasure. And if you can't read somebody for pleasure, you don't need me to finish that. You might think you do. You might think that there is another reason to read. If I haven't convinced you otherwise in all this time, I will work harder. Let's just leave it at that and say I can read Plato for pleasure, and therefore Plato is worthwhile. These translations are fairly good. I have never really understood why Plato is treated this way. In his dialogues, typically you know the setup. Socrates, this slightly idealized, although very much individual. There's a lot of joshing that goes on here. Sophocles was a swart, pug-nosed, ugly, older man who held the youth of Athens in sway because he took them seriously and talked to them about essentials. He made them unbearable, just as he was unbearable, because he wouldn't have been unbearable if he'd had a job at the box factory, but he didn't. He was a professional gadfly. But he's an amazing character in these dialogues, and the form they typically take is that he will propose some sort of question, or he will overhear someone windily pronouncing on some subject and undermine their confidence in it by questioning it. I don't think there's a whole lot to the Socratic method. I don't think there's a whole lot to a lot of Socrates' methods, and I don't think there's a whole lot of validity either. I don't think he's being held up, though, as this kind of Sherlock Holmesian figure who is seeing further than everybody else and is certainly right about everything. Instead, these are fun thought experiments. They really are. If you haven't read any of the dialogues of Plato, it'll take you an hour to read one, or less than that, and it will give you lots of food for thought, and you will also enjoy it. It is enjoyable. They have a dramatic tension, interplay of personality runs throughout each dialogue, so that you get the very much the sense that Plato was a student of the great dramatists of his day, which, some of the greatest dramatists of all time were working during his day. He probably knew them. He certainly shopped at the same places they did. We don't have to worry about the pitiless ratio here. One of the hobby horses in the Daily Penguin is the pitiless ratio of survival. We're going to be getting that this week in spades. But with Plato, not so much. The other hobby horse that we have dwelt with in this series is the choices made by Penguin Classics themselves. in presenting this author. And I confess I do not understand those choices. On one level, on a purely pragmatic level, I understand why you would have 2 volumes like this and maybe 2 more. Why you would do that. It's because these are largely aimed at schools, at undergraduate college courses, and a teacher at an undergraduate college course that has all of Western philosophy to handle is probably only going to want you to read the Euthyphro. That's probably the only thing they're going to want you to read. Now, right now, you could get that free. You could download it free. But colleges like to have books. They like to assign books. They like to sell books. So I can understand why, if let's say you want just the Meno, well, then you would only want this volume. But nevertheless, plenty of people read Penguin Classics who aren't students or college professors. And I'm not sure. I know I've hit this note before, but it's my Penguin Classic tour, and it's not a series of disinterested tutorials, right? This is my reactions to these penguins. You'd be getting these rants in a much more concentrated form if I were doing this as a normal shelf tour. I do not understand why there is not a big, fat Penguin Classic Dialogues of Plato. I don't understand why that is. First, it also addresses the pragmatic element, because I am sure such a volume would be popular in schools. Positive that it would be. As popular as these things, except you wouldn't be able to charge twice. But also because I like to think that Penguin doesn't just care about schools, that they're a reprint house with a great deal of editorial conscience. And I think that would be really neat, to have a big, ornate volume of all of Plato, plus scholarship. And you know what I want that volume to be. It isn't, unfortunately, Adam Beresford or Christopher Rowe. Because when you're reprinting classics, you're not just reprinting, the latest translation, because the act of translation also has its own history. And some of those translations are classics in their own right. So I know Penguin doesn't have money to burn, but in an ideal world, I would want them to do something like what we saw with the Iliad, where they have their original prose translation, the one that helped to kick off their line in the first place. They have Robert Graves' weird adaptation. They have Alexander Pope's translation, the complete translation by Alexander Pope of the Iliad, because it is recognized as a great work on its own right, as well as a great version of Homer. And they also have a new verse translation, the newest, hottest thing in a verse translation. There's a lot of variety there, and I wish, in an ideal world, I would like to see that variety reflected elsewhere. Like, for instance, the Essays of Montaigne. It's a big, fat volume. Penguin makes a big, fat volume with, I think, Donald Frame is the translator. But you only have the one volume. You don't have the Florio Montaigne. And it is a classic translation. Same thing with Plutarch. You don't have a one-volume complete Plutarch in a new translation. I would love that, but you don't have that. You also don't have the one-volume North Plutarch or the one-volume Dryden Plutarch, when they are classics of translation. Same thing with Chapman and the Iliad, Golding and Ovid's Metamorphoses, and a million other examples. You could come up with a million other examples. You know what I'm talking about. That ideally, in an ideal world in which publishers didn't need to worry about money or readership, I would love it if Penguin Classic would honor great translations as well as the latest modern thing. And if they were going to do that, the one-volume Plato that I would want would be Benjamin Jowett, the great Victorian Don, whose translation of Plato's dialogues and also the scholarly introductions that he did for them and notes supporting them deserve immortality. It is an incredible work of translation and explication, an incredible work. And as far as I can remember, I have almost never seen an accessible paperback one-volume Jowett Plato. I've almost never seen that. And I've never seen it in Penguin Classic. And that's unfortunate. Jowett introduced, I don't know how many, we'll never know how many, millions of readers to Plato. And that is a testament to something. That's a testament that his introduction to Plato works. His scholarship, his introductions to each dialogue, his general introduction, the translations themselves, these things work. It'd be nice if they had greater life. I did not check ahead of time. I am a substandard waddler. I did not check ahead of time to see if the Jowett Plato exists at all right now, if it's reprinted by anybody right now. And I also didn't check, now that I think about it, to see if maybe the Jowett Plato is available for free. Surely the copyright has run out on it by now. That would have been in the Victorian era. So that no one could still be holding a copyright on that. It might be possible to just put it on your phone. Wouldn't that be something? I'll have to check into that and see. In the meantime, do recommend it. I recommend these two translators as well. Plato is not, he's not all that difficult. When we're talking about Greek to English, it's possible to get not just the gist, but very much the flavor and even some of the details of Plato into English. He's not an author in this Daily Penguin where I'll say, oh, you're missing so much. Not at all. But nevertheless, there are interesting variations between translators. There are decisions that you have to make. Some Greek constructions, Greek words, as a translator, you have to make a decision because the Greek word is doing 6 things. Well, how many English words or constructions do you know that do 6 things at the same time? Not many. There aren't many. There aren't many that do even 3 at the same time. But in Greek, I don't know how many of you have tried to learn ancient Greek. It's quite the roller coaster ride. It's a weird language. One of the more advanced languages, I think. But even so, it doesn't become a translator issue with Plato, which is another reason why I think Jowett should live. He should be immortal. His translation still works just fine. And that is your Daily Penguin for today. It is not what you would think. It is not a tirade against Plato, because Plato in the Socratic Dialogues is not really doing philosophy. He's laying the groundwork for what Aristotle and a bunch of other posers would then make into philosophy, but I don't think he's doing it himself. This is more of an entertainment. This is more of, let's bounce around these ideas and see what we make of them. And always in the focal point, through the lens of the semi-comic character of Socrates himself. That makes this very different. A much more, if philosophy were still written this way, dramatized, enjoyable, then I would probably read it with a lot more favorable eye. As it is, I think the closest that we come is the novels of Iris Murdoch. And I've heard varying statements. Let's just say I've heard varying verdicts across a wide spectrum about how enjoyable the novels of Iris Murdoch are. So that might not be a good example. But one way or another, that is what we have for today. I only have these 2 Penguin volumes of anything of Plato. I don't plan on getting any more. And this is a case where if I found or somebody were to bring out a really nice new, imagine it, a trade paperback, deckled edges and French flaps, a new cover illustration, maybe a new preface to the whole Jowett Plato. If somebody were to do that, I would get that in a heartbeat and never even look at these Penguin Classics and probably not even look at my Lobes anymore. I would probably just use that. I consult Plato so seldom. That would probably be the Plato on the shelf. As far as I know, no one's done that. So right now, these are the Platos that I have on my shelf. And I confess, when I go back to these, it's usually the Last Days of Socrates, and it's usually just the introduction and notes, not the works themselves. This is not an author like some of the ones that we've seen and will see this week, where it's not just essential part of a Penguin Classic wall, but it's also an essential part of me. That is not true in the case of Plato. Maybe it should be, maybe it will be someday, but not at the moment. So that's your Daily Penguin for today. We'll continue tomorrow with more. I'm assuming, since we've done the ancient Hebrews and we've done ancient Greece, I'm assuming that you're all up for a little trip back to ancient Rome. I certainly am. So I'm not doing a very good job of hiding my own predilections here. I very much like the Romans, but even so, I'll stand over the wall and wander around and spend a wonderful hour thinking about it, and we'll see each other tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.